The movie begins with a girl who is seen crying and scared for her life. She is tied up in a basement trying to get away. Somehow, she manages to break free and grabs a metal rod. She heads for the basement door and slowly opens it. The guy who kidnapped her called Herman is eating breakfast. He suddenly gets up and goes to check on his prey. When he opens the basement door, she tries to attack him. She then quickly descends the stairs and grabs a baseball bat. She surprises him from behind, hitting him with a bat. She lands a few good blows, but for some reason doesn't finish him off and runs up the stairs to the kitchen. Herman quickly gets up and reaches her. She beats him again with a bat, and instead of killing him outright, she jumps through a window and leaps over the wall. Unfortunately, she breaks her ankle and is in a lot of pain. She manages to find the strength to carry on and reaches a desolate area near the concrete river in Los Angeles. When she goes up the bank, she is about to cross the street but is hit by Herman with his car. He ties her hands and puts her in the trunk. Herman then cleans her up and puts a wedding dress on her. Later, he takes the girl into the woods and buries her. The man then returns to the basement and tries to figure out how the girl escaped. This time he builds a cage to contain his next victim. In the next scene, we see him in a mini market where he sets his sights on his next victim, a girl named Rudy who turns out to be his neighbor. Like a psychopath, Herman begins to study Rudy and he steals letters from her garbage to find out more about her. One night, he follows Rudy and her friend drunkenly out of a bar all the way home. He stays to observe while the girls are fooling around. A little later, he sneaks inside the house. He then finds Rudy in the bedroom and knocks her unconscious. Rudy wakes up confused inside the cage in Herman's basement. The man violently grabs her hands and begins to cut her nails and strangely, stores them in a small jar. Rudy falls unconscious again and the scene then shifts to her friend who is looking for her. When Rudy wakes up again, she sees Herman writing her name on a piece of wood with a knife. Rudy finally realizes what is happening and asks where she is. He gets her water, bread and a container to do her needs. Rudy loses it and yells at him to let her go. Herman quietly explains that no one can hear her because the basement is soundproof and the cage is purposely built. Rudy asks what he plans to do with her but Herman doesn't answer and leaves. The next day, Rudy wakes up and looks around and that's when she sees all the tools that the psychopath keeps there. She tries to climb up so that she can get out through the gap and almost succeeds, but she loses hope and collapses to the ground in tears. Later Herman brings her lunch and suggests that she eat. Herman assures her that he will not kill her, but he needs to take her blood and asks Rudy to give him her hand but she is afraid. Herman tells her that it will be like a blood donation but when Rudy refuses again, Herman tells her that she forced him to do this and things could be far easier if she listens to him. After finishing up he puts the blood in a jar and places it near the souvenirs collected from previous victims. Meanwhile, Rudy's friend reports her missing to the police. She has no idea what happened to her and is extremely worried. Later when Rudy wakes up, she finds the cage door open. Suddenly, a corpse covered in mud and worms appears and grabs her hand. It is a woman in a wedding dress and freaks her out. Luckily for her, it turns out to be just a nightmare. The next morning Rudy notices a nail slightly sticking out in the cage. She tries to pull it out but is not able to. Soon Herman arrives and brings her lunch. When Rudy asks him the name of the previous victim, Herman looks around and that's when we discover that he keeps photos of all the girls he has kidnapped. Next, we see the psychopath taking Rudy's excrement and putting it in a jar. Rudy has an emotional breakdown and begs him not to kill her like all the other girls. Herman laughs and tells he will not hurt her. He later goes to the convenience store to buy snacks for her. Next, we see Rudy's friend hanging up flyers about her disappearance. Rudy has another nightmare in which she sees Herman burying a girl. She starts digging with her bare hands and discovers the girl dressed as a bride with a plastic bag over her head. Rudy suddenly wakes up and calls Herman to inform him that she has started her period. He asks for her dirty underwear, promising to bring her some clean ones. When Herman returns, she asks him to buy tampons. Herman goes back to the convenience store to buy them. After he brings her dinner, Rudy starts a conversation telling him about her family. Rudy even lets him eat a piece of cake out of her hands. Herman appears to soften and no longer sees her as his next victim. That evening he goes right back to the convenience store to buy some more things. Meanwhile, Rudy tries her hardest to pull out the nail. When Herman returns, he again takes her excrement to store it in a jar. Then he tells her about his previous victim. Herman tells her that he was sure that she was in love with him, at which point Rudy bursts out laughing. She tells him that the girl was just scared to death and acted like she loved him. Outraged, Herman says he doesn't want to talk to her anymore and leaves. Rudy tells him that no one loves him. Herman orders her to shut up or he will never feed her again. That evening, Herman returns to the convenience store to buy something for his stomach pain. The cashier tells him that they are closing, but he doesn't listen. When she insults him, he looks at her in a threatening way. When the lady finishes her shift that night, Herman is waiting for her outside, and when she goes to her car, he surprises her from behind with a baseball bat. He then goes home and cleans up as if nothing has happened. The next morning, he is eating breakfast and Rudy starts calling him, but he ignores her. In the evening, he opens the door to take a look at her. Rudy apologizes for what she said and asks Herman for food, but he slams the door and ignores her. Later, Rudy begins hallucinating and has more nightmares in which she sees Herman's previous victims. Some of them have been tortured to death. At one point, Rudy sees a bucket of water and tries in vain to reach for it. Later, Herman enters to finally bring her some food and water, but he doesn't speak to her. Meanwhile, Rudy's friends still continue to search for her. She calls all of Rudy's friends and relatives to ask if they have seen her anywhere, but receives no useful information. One evening, Herman asks Rudy if she has ever thought about getting married. Rudy says she would if she met the right guy, and Herman smiles. After Herman leaves, Rudy tries again to get the nail out, and after numerous attempts, she finally succeeds. She bursts out laughing with joy and begins to think of a plan to get out. The next evening, while Herman is reading, she holds the nail behind her back and asks him if she can take a walk in the basement as her legs hurt. Herman tells her no, but suggests he can massage her feet. Rudy agrees, and Herman cannot believe his ears. He gets on his knees and tells her to put her legs out through the gap. He begins to nervously touch her feet. Next, Rudy pulls her leg back and asks him to open the door so he can massage her completely. Herman is still not convinced, so Rudy turns around and asks him to massage her back. She then asks him again to open the door. By this stage, Herman is sweating and pulls out his keys, but then runs away to wash his hands. Later, Herman returns and says she is dirty and needs to wash her. He insistently asks her for her clothes. Herman starts washing her with ice-cold water. Rudy begs him to stop and gives him some of her clothes. Holding the nail tightly in her hand, Rudy tells him to enter the cage to play with her. Herman is tempted, but he is still not completely convinced. Rudy gets angry and begins to insult him. Herman takes the bat and tells her that it is her fault for what is going to happen soon. He then goes to Rudy's friend's house and kidnaps her. He brings her to the basement in front of the cage and begins to torture her. Suddenly there is a knock on the door. Herman greets the Jehovah's Witnesses with a knife behind his back and says it is not the best time for a visit. Suddenly, the girls start screaming and the guests hear. Herman starts stabbing them to death. In the process, Rudy's friend recovers and she tells her to pretend to be unconscious. When Herman returns to the basement, Rudy distracts him and her friend picks up the knife on the floor. When she tries to stab him, Herman turns around and grabs her arm. Rudy quickly hits him with a nail. The other girl takes the baseball bat and starts beating him. She then takes the keys and opens the lock, but suddenly, Herman wakes up and attacks her. Rudy gets out of the cage and frantically goes upstairs to the kitchen. In the process, Herman drags the other girl down to the basement and ties her hands. He then discovers that Rudy has escaped and goes looking for her. Herman finds her in one of the rooms and asks her to return to the cage or he will kill her friend. At that point, the other girl appears and Rudy hits Herman in his injured shoulder. Rudy and her friend then escape to the bathroom. They are horrified to find the lifeless bodies of the Jehovah's Witnesses. As Rudy's friend tries to open the window, Herman goes inside and stabs her repeatedly. Next, we see Rudy, who finds a wedding dress in one of the rooms and puts it on. She then calls Herman, claiming that he has won, and invites him to the basement. Rudy approaches the cage and lures him towards her. Then she suddenly hits him with a sharp instrument between the legs and locks him inside the cage. In the last scene, we see Rudy escaped walking around in a bloodstained wedding dress, and the movie ends there. You guys are awesome if you have made it this far in the video. If you want to see more of such movie recaps, hit the subscribe button to become part of our movie family.